Let me tell you a little bit about the author, Catherine. Catherine Children is a BA in history at UCLA, has studied the Shakespeare authorship question for over 26 years. She has debated English professors from the Smithsonian Institute, Mechanics Institute Library, and in April 2012 received a Distinguished Scholarship Award at Concordia University, Portland, Oregon for Shakespeare Suppressed. And I guess we're going to get into, the origins of the Shakespeare works, and there's a lot of doubt over this. It's something I'm aware of from the work of Francis Bacon, and maybe we'll touch a little bit on that, but it's not Catherine's angle, I believe. What an awesome book, by the way, I have to say, just before I bring my co-host and guest on for today. It's about 400 pages, and it's well researched and it's academic, and you can tell that this woman has devoted her life to researching the subject. So let me bring our co-host on first. Mark, are you with me today?
Hi, James. Yes, I'm here.
Hey, my good friend Mark Eddy. It's good to talk to you, brother, again. Sorry for surprising you for a show, but you're well versed in this subject matter today, and I can't think of somebody better to join me. Great to talk to you again. Yeah, great to talk to you again, Mark. We're going to get into some Shakespeare stuff today.
All right.
Yeah, and we're going to talk to our guest right now. So let me talk to Catherine. Are you with us on the line, Catherine?
Yes, I am.
Wow, thank you, and welcome to Capricorn Radio, Catherine.
My pleasure.
Catherine, that's quite an awesome academic piece of work that you have put together in that book. And when I get books submitted to the show and they come to the letterbox and they just poof off the floor, I know it's well researched. It's heavy duty. It hit the floor like a brick, but it's beautiful. These are the type of books I love because I know somebody has devoted a large chunk of their life and time to do this, and you're obviously passionate about this. Like all my guests, Catherine, I'm always intrigued in the person. Tell me about you as a person, what you like to do as a scholar, what drives you, and give us a bit of your personal background.
Sure. Well, after I graduated at UCLA, I fell into the authorship question about Shakespeare, seeing a debate on TV, and I saw an academic from, I believe it was Princeton, debating Charlton Ogburn, who believes that the Earl of Oxford was the true Shakespeare. And all the Princeton scholar could say was doing attacks, saying that this is just a conspiracy theory, there's no evidence, and calling the man names like you're an amateur, that type of thing. And meanwhile, the Charlton Ogburn, he just named fact after fact that made perfect sense. And I didn't know anything about this, but I was a history major. And so I looked into it, and it just bit me. I just wanted to tell everybody about it. I read his book, and I started to give talks, and I just thought it was an extremely important thing to tell the world. I think that so many people love Shakespeare, and they want to know more about him. But it seems that the gatekeepers of Shakespeare are shutting them out. And I want to try and go directly to the public. And I got decided to finally write a book about this after being into it for over 20 years. When I saw a TV program in national TV in America, and they were interviewing an English literature professor, and he, in essence, put down the whole idea of there being an authorship question. I thought, who can get away with doing that? Who can, in essence, put down many people who are into the authorship question on national TV and not have to apologize for it? And so that's when I decided, okay, I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to try and put it from his point of view to see, what makes them so confident that the great author is who they think it is. And that led to almost 7 years. And I'm pretty happy with the results.
Wow. I do know one thing, Catherine, that Shakespeare fanatics do not like anybody addressing this question. They're quite dogmatic and sensitive about the whole thing.
Yes, but they're the ones who also cannot defend their case. I think they're enamored of the idea that someone with little education and no connections could turn himself into the greatest writer of the English language. I think it's really more of fantasy or a hope than actual reality, and that's what my book goes into, the actual contemporary evidence for the Stratford man, and that's zero.
Wow. Of course, I mentioned Francis Bacon maybe being an author. I know that's not what we're going to talk about today, Catherine, but I first became aware of this whole subject matter through the work of Ignatius Donnelly, the great cryptogram. I actually have a first edition on my shelf. It's the only, I was reading Atlantis actually, and I came across some first editions, and I actually had addressed somebody. I went, first of all, I wanted to know, was this true or not, maybe. And, I asked somebody about it, and I was met with such disdain and aggression. However, there was no thorough examination of the subject or discussion. It was just pure, dogmatic aggression and no academic philosophy at all on it. Like.
Yes. That's the usual thing. It's just, emotions come to the fore, and, people who defend the Stratford man just kind of will basically just put you down or put the old concept down, but they won't get into the evidence, and that's what we want to do.
I guess that's a good point.
Donnelly, he was using cryptograms to help provide evidence that he was Bacon, the great author was Bacon. But really, we don't really need to use cryptograms. I'm not an advocate of the cryptograms, but
sure.
There's so much other evidence during the lifetime that during contemporary evidence that builds the case for an alternative author, and also that the Stratford man was not the great author. We don't really need those, in my opinion.
Sure.
So,
address the main question first about the Stratford man, or the idea of an alternative author. I guess that's the main question before you even point fingers. I know there was a movie as well, Catherine, wasn't there, in 2012 or 2011?
Yeah, Anonymous.
Anonymous, that's right.
Yeah, Anonymous. It was an English production, and it was very good. It was wonderful in that it showed a separation. It showed the man born in Stratford-on-Avon, we call him the Stratford man, and then they showed somebody else as being the true author, and that, in essence, he was his cover. I don't 100% believe in that theory, but it at least it separated the two, the real author and the Stratford man, and that was the best part of it.
I guess then there's two things to talk about. There's Stratford upon Avon, the location of Shakespeare, and then there's the Stratford man. So I guess let's talk about Stratford upon Avon first, the location of Shakespeare, where all the tourists go today, Catherine. Everybody flocks to Stratford upon Avon in England, known as the great place of the birthplace of the great author. And but this might not be correct, according to you, Catherine.
Right. Well, first off, I want to explain that there are two types of evidence for one to make a biography or a case for somebody being an author. There is contemporary lifetime evidence, and then there's posthumous evidence. Now, the concept that the great author William Shakespeare was from Stratford-on-Avon is entirely posthumous evidence, and that's what we need to clarify from the very beginning. If you look at the contemporary evidence, there was no association between Stratford and the great author. This is when the Stratford man was alive. So it was only occurring after his death that fingers started to point to that town as being associated with the great author. But during his lifetime, Shakespeare's contemporaries, people in the literary world, were describing him as somebody a little bit different. And that's what that's the evidence that we need to be focusing upon.
Sure. Mark, do you want to jump in there with a question?
Sure, James. Catherine, when I went to Stratford, I also stopped by New Place, and I picked up one of the brochures, and it says one of the indisputable facts about Shakespeare is that when he was approaching the peak of his fame and success as a playwright in London, he purchased the house in Stratford-upon-Avon known as New Place. That first sentence of the guidebook seems defensive. Why would they be so defensive about his retirement home?
Well, I think they're really more being defensive that he was the great author. I think that's what, and they have a right to be, because they've been sort of attacked for the last 150 years. So, if you go to the birthplace of the great author, new place was in his retirement. But if you go to the birthplace, of course I haven't been there in years, but when I was there, they had like a little placards that said, well, this chair have been the type of chair that, Shakespeare sat in, or this is the type of bed that everything in the house was inauthentic. There was no Shakespeare relics. Actually the birthplace house, they're not even sure 100% if that is the true house. So there is a lot of controversy of where he actually was born. So maybe that also tied into the identification of new place. But I do believe it's fairly solid.
What about this school there in town, where he supposedly attended school?
Right. That's another great point. There's no records of that particular period of a William Shakespeare attending school. It's just assumed because his father he was an alderman of the town, so it was assumed that he would go. But even with that, they think that he maybe attended school till he was about age 12 or 13. So we're not talking about a superlative education here.
What about records? There must be other records, birthplace, baptism, stuff like that, marriage.
Yeah, we have his christening, we have his children's christenings, we have his marriage, and we have him owing lists of him owing taxes. We have a deposition that he gave for a lawsuit. We have his father putting in an application for a coat of arms. We have records of him selling stone and grain and buying real estate, but we don't have any contemporary records of him owning a book or being a writer. There's no manuscripts in his handwriting, which is very unusual.
Wow.
Besides, there's being no evidence that he went to school.
This is murky, Catherine. This is a really murky investigation.
Yeah. The more you dig into it, the more incredible the case becomes.
Yeah. And I guess that's the thing. It really is an investigation, Catherine. It is like, there's several lines of evidence to follow up. We'll get into that. But the literacy thing is you're talking about one of the greatest literalists that ever lived.
He invented over 2,000 words.
Wow.
He wasn't just anything. And the real killer is his parents were illiterate. And so he was raised in an illiterate household, but also his children were illiterate. Now that tells you something's really majorly wrong,
Okay, so let's talk.
That wasn't good English, but anyway.
Let's talk like we're investigators here. So we're saying there's a Stratford guy here who's William Shakespeare, and then there was a person, the real author, as we call, and, he was the literal person. He was the great author that we know, but we don't actually know who he really was. And we've got this other guy. I don't think it's fair to call him an imposter. I think maybe he was, do you think because of what the nature of the context of the writing, he was, the real writer was airing political theories or experimenting with some stuff?
We have to first establish that the name William Shakespeare was someone's pen name. And then there was somebody who was using that pen name, right? But the complication is that there was also someone who was born with that name in Stratford-on-Avon. Actually, there were several people with that name born William Shakespeare. But somehow the man from Stratford and the great author who was using this pen name with a similar name, somehow the two got mixed. And that's what I devote 2 chapters to in my book, is how and why.
Do you think it was accidental, Catherine? There's obviously a case it could be accidentally mixed.
I don't think it was accidental. I
don't either, but I'm playing devil's advocate. But
Yeah, no, I do believe it was deliberate. I do think there was something political behind it. There's a quote as late as 1640. This is years after the Stratford man had died, where some anonymous writer said, "Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise." So we can't openly praise you, you know. So why was that necessary decades after he had died? So that is right off the bat is a tip-off that there was something important, something probably politically important about Shakespeare that needed to be kept quiet.
Mm-hmm. I mean, how common was the name William Shakespeare? Let's focus on the name for the moment. Let's say the real Stratford guy called William Shakespeare, living in Stratford upon Avon. How common was that name? How big was the town? You know, what's the statistics of that guy being there, having that name?
Well, the first thing to note is in all the records that we do have that are definitely involving a Stratford man, of all of his records, most of them the name was spelled phonetically, and it was not, as we know, Shakespeare. It was mostly, if you pronounce it phonetically, Shakespeare, with a short A, and Shakespeare, Shakespeare, Shakespeare. That's in the majority of cases. There are a couple of occasions where the Stratford man's name was spelled as we know, the great authors, but just a few instances. So that's the first tip-off that we're not talking about the right man. But there have been lists made of several William Shakespeares who were alive during that period. And actually one I found in 1605, he was living in the same county as the Stratford man, which is Warwickshire.
Sure.
And he was enlisted in the army or something. So, and we know that in that time period, supposedly, the Stratford man was recently an actor in the King's Men acting company, and he was working in essence for the king, if you want to believe that he was. And so it can't be the same man. So yes, there were a few William Shakespeares back then. But actually, if you look at how when there were references to the great author William Shakespeare, in over almost half of those occasions in print, the name had a hyphen in it, which separated shake from spear.
Wow.
This is a noun and a verb combination.
Wow.
And it was implied as a made-up name. And spear shaking, which was jousting.
Sure.
And in the book, I give several instances where contemporary writers of that period used that expression of spear shaking. So it was a known expression. It was more of a warlike expression.
Yeah.
Kind of a threatening action where you're shaking your spear at somebody.
Of course, the English language was very fluid back then, Catherine. It was always changing and evolving. And like you say, 2,000 words were created.
Yes. He was incredibly educated. He knew rhetoric, he knew ancient Latin, ancient Greek, he knew French and Italian, he knew European geography, he knew all about the aristocracy, their customs, their sports, he knew about the Bible. You could just, the law, he knew about the law. The list is incredible.
Botany as well.
Then, if you're going to learn the law, you had to go to a law school, and they called them the Inns of Court. And we have those records, and they still survive, and there is no William Shakespeare listed. There's no William Shakespeare listed at Cambridge or Oxford University, where rhetoric was taught there. The more you look at how well educated Shakespeare was, the more the Stratford man unfortunately gets disqualified, because we don't have any accounting of him getting any of this knowledge. Where did he learn it? They didn't have public libraries back then.
Sure. Botany and astronomy as well.
Yes, astronomy. Yeah, in one case they think that he was referring to the supernova of 1572 that I don't know
wow.
I think Tycho Brahe had noted. So they're finding these things all the time in the Shakespeare work.
Wow, this is incredibly fast. This guy was not just highly educated. There's very few people in the country at that time would have been educated to that status.
Right. And that's why when we talk about alternative authors, they throw out Queen Elizabeth, they throw out Francis Bacon. All the people they throw out, the Earl of Oxford, they were very, very highly educated people. They don't. That's why there so many people do think it's logical that it was somebody else.
Yeah, the pool of people to choose from the educated elite is very, very small, I guess, Catherine.
Yes,
wow.
Yes, and like I said, we have enrollment records during that period, and there's no Shakespeare involved.
Mark, do you want to jump in for a question there? Did you want to say something?
Sure. Catherine, just a couple minutes ago you mentioned that Shakespeare created 2,000 words, and if you look at the 6 known autographs, 3 times in the same day he writes his name differently.
Yeah.
That just seems very odd that someone with such a great vocabulary can't write his name the same way on his will.
Yes, and they're very badly formed signatures as well. And it wasn't just because he was ill. I think that he just was, I'm sorry to say, I think he was illiterate. And knowing his background, as far as the facts go, relating to his background. That's another great point that a lot of people don't know, is that there are no manuscripts in Shakespeare's handwriting. There's no plain manuscripts. And yet we're talking about, he authored around approximately 40 plays and 154 sonnets. I mean, he was the most prolific writer out there, and yet we don't have any manuscripts. We don't have letters that he wrote to people. We don't have anything.
I find it hard to believe there's only 6 signatures of this guy.
Yeah.
This guy's like a
and
ghost.
They're all on legal documents. Like, as Mark said, 3 are on his will, and the other 3 are on other legal documents.
This
and
guy's...
they're all, and actually the spellings are different, too.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I mean, if this was a modern case today, with you had CSI involved, they would throw this case out the window. Like, it doesn't add up. It doesn't add up in a lot of, even like in forensics and handwriting and stuff. Like, I mean, I think that's one of the biggest areas of research into this subject matter, Catherine. But this guy is like a ghost, Catherine. This guy is like a ghost.
Yeah, and then the interesting thing too is that he never claimed to be the great author, the Stratford man. He didn't claim it. His neighbors didn't take any notice of it. His children never said so. And his last descendant was his granddaughter. She lived to, I think, 1670. And nobody visited his relatives. She never wrote anything about her grandfather.
Mm.
So, that brings us to the question is, well, if the town didn't regard him as Shakespeare, then how did we come to know him as Shakespeare? And that's when we start looking at the posthumous evidence.
Mm. So let's put this in context. I mean, everybody knows the name Shakespeare today, Catherine. And the popularity of this figurehead, if we want to call him that, is like phenomenal. I mean, and most people even know of Stratford upon Avon just because of Shakespeare, this place in Warwickshire. However, how popular was the works of Shakespeare in Shakespeare's time? I mean, how popular was the plays? How popular was the sonnets?
They were very popular. The very first publication with his name in print was the poem Venus and Adonis. Most probably don't know that today, but back then that was extremely popular. And then also the Rape of Lucrece, which was the next, in the following year, was printed. And many comments were referred to Venus and Adonis. And also the plays. There are references to the plays by contemporaries. They didn't talk about the man, they talked about the works. And the Queen Elizabeth, she saw at least 2 plays, if you can believe what was written on title pages when some of the plays were printed, that she visited them. And yet there's no accounting of the Queen meeting Shakespeare. And we do have accounts of her meeting other famous writers of period like John Lilly.
Sure.
And also King James, her successor, He also liked the Shakespeare plays. He had several of them at court in two different periods. There were like the winter season, Christmas season. There were two occasions where there were about 6 or 7 Shakespeare plays performed. So it was very popular at court and also very popular with people.
So,
and
what do we know of this guy in Stratford? Was he hard up for cash? Like, could he not have claimed some fame went along for the ride? Was he an honest man? Maybe he didn't want to. Maybe he was an honest guy. Do we know much about the guy and his integrity?
What we know about him, okay, there's not a lot that we don't know about him, but what we do know about him is he was connected to the theater. He was the owner of shares of 2 different theaters, the Globe Theater and the Blackfriars Theater. He was a businessman, really. And he's also, in 1603, he was a member of the King's Men Acting Company. And on another occasion, he was cited for receiving a payment for a play performance. So he was definitely involved with the theater, but in my opinion, he was really more of a financier. He was a moneylender. It's on record that he was a moneylender for private people. I think he was a moneylender for the theatrical troupes, too, and an investor. And I really think that's it. I mean, it just is a kind of a remarkable coincidence, but there were 2 people with the name William Shakespeare who were involved in the theater at the same time. And one was a pen name and one was somebody born with that name. And I think that's really what happened. And it's not as unusual as people may think because, for example, there were 2 poets named John Davies in this time frame, same period. And scholars today are still mixing up which John Davies wrote which work. So I think that's what's going on here. So we need to separate these 2.
Sure. And that's the thing, and that's why you record him as a Stratford man, and then we have the Great Order, as you say.
Right.
Tell me, Catherine, about you. How do you go about the research, or how have you gone about the research, I should say? You must have employed many methods to research something that happened so long ago.
Yes. There's a lot of great secondary sources out there, for the time period of the theater. And there's also, I try to focus on the primary ones. And, it's just, they're out there. Some of them you can access via the internet. And I actually went to back then it was called the Public Records Office. Now it's called the National Archives. I went there to look at a few documents. Actually, the physical documents, 16th century documents. And, I was lucky in a sense because there's so much Shakespeare research out there. So many resources to look at. And if you call all the relevant points, you can make your case, and that's what I did.
I think it's, like you said, there's so much research out there. I think because it's such a fascinating research topic. I mean, we know the name as the brand. It's like having a brand in a household brand, but not knowing who the company owner is, basically.
Yeah. Now imagine you've got over 200 years of scholarship, and they still cannot tell you when Hamlet was written. They don't have a concrete date for that. They don't have a concrete dating of composition for any Shakespeare play. They don't know the total amount of plays that he wrote. They don't know what the first play was that he wrote. They don't know what the last play was that he wrote. It's all question marks. And for me, I think the reason is they don't have a biography to match it against.
Yeah.
And that's a great problem. And they've had all these years, and they can't finalize anything really about Shakespeare. In fact, that was before I even knew about the authorship question. I read Hamlet, and I saw a list of all of the Shakespeare plays and the dates, and every date had a question mark next to it. And I thought, gee, it's been so long, they still don't know when these plays were written, And that's another reason why we need to start focusing on the right man.
Sure.
And we're going to get those answers.
Sure. Mark, do you want to jump in with a question there?
Sure. Catherine, doesn't the first folio have some biographical information that would, tie together all these loose ends?
Yes, and you just hit on the reason why we believe that the Stratford man was a great author. It all emanates from this book, the first folio, which was the first collection of Shakespeare plays in print, and that was printed in 1623. And the opening 16 pages are basically tributes to Shakespeare. And in two of these tributes, we have these clues. One of them was written by Ben Jonson, and he uses the phrase, "sweet swan of Avon," referring to Shakespeare. So we have an association with Avon in one spot. And in another poem by Leonard Digges, we have a reference to Shakespeare having a Stratford monument. So you put Stratford and Avon together, and you can kind of imply that the great author was from Stratford upon Avon. So that really is where it starts. But there were many Stratfords back then in that period, with towns with the name Stratford in it, still are, and as well as many towns with the name Avon in it, too.
Sure.
But that exact phrase is not in these prefatory pages. There's also no other sense of biography in these pages. We don't know when he died or when he was born. There's no reference to his family in these pages. Keep in mind that 5 of these pages are blank. And there was plenty of space to go into, to describe the Stratford man if he really was the great author. There was space for his coat of arms, it's not in there. So it's just these kind of enigmatic little clues that were dropped. And when you combine that with an actual monument to Shakespeare in the Stratford upon Avon Church, that's when the connections, solidified. And so the general public has been looking to Stratford on Avon as the birthplace ever since.
Mm-hmm. I was always led to believe, maybe force-fed this idea, I should say, that he was hard up on his times and he was just a struggling actor, or he was struggling to make a living and, writing away, but we really don't know if that's true or not.
No, we don't. All we have is that he for sure was a member of an acting company. But they don't know when he became an actor. They don't know when he became a writer. It's all nebulous. I mean, they write biographies filled with speculation because there's just no hard facts. The first reference to him being in London, the first documentary record, occurred in 1592. And it had nothing to do with the theater. It was, he was giving a loan to someone named John Clayton. And they usually ignore that. But, he's first sighted in the theater center, London, when he was 28 years old. That's a pretty late start, especially if you look at his contemporary, Edward Allen, who was a big actor back then. He started when he was a teenager, and he, went on to great fame. So he's another great example, Edward Allen. There's so much evidence. The roles he played, what companies he was with, associated. We have manuscripts that he left behind. Actually, an annotated manuscript with his own annotations for a play. We have his sword. I think his sword. We have some of his relics, in other words. But nothing can of the same nature has survived with Shakespeare.
Wow, fascinating. Let's concentrate again on the pen name for a second, Catherine. Is it that hard to accept that there might have been a pen name? You usually have either Shakespeare wrote the works of Shakespeare, or else it was a conspiracy in that, somebody wanted to air political theories, but there may have been more Shakespeares out there. It's not illogical to think that there may have been a few Shakespeares.
Yeah, well, when you look at all the absence of evidence, like none of his contemporaries claim to have known him personally, and when you have, no record of his education, no record of this, all these zeros, all these holes in the historical record, no manuscripts. Then the idea that the name was a pen name starts to make sense. And you could even look at actually things that he wrote personally, like, for example, in Sonnet 81, he was addressing the fair youth, the young man, and he said that your name, meaning the young man's name, from hence immortal life shall have, though I once gone, to all the world must die. Now, the interesting thing is that this young man's name is not noted in any of Shakespeare's sonnets. There's only one person who was associated in print with Shakespeare, and that's the Earl of Southampton. So he's saying, from hence, Southampton, your name will live forever, but my name will not live forever. Well, how's that possible when Shakespeare's name was next to Southampton's in print in 2 occasions? Well, to me, the logical explanation is the name Shakespeare was not the man's real name. And that's why he was saying, though I once gone, to all the world must die. He knew that his name would not survive him, that only the pen name would survive him.
Wow.
He also refers to, I think, the pen name in his dedication letter to the Earl of Southampton for Venus and Adonis. And he names, this is the first heir of my invention. And of course, we think that the invention is this poem, Venus and Adonis, but I think it makes more sense that the invention was the invented pen name, because how could Venus and Adonis, which is an extremely sophisticated poem, how could that be the first invention of the great author?
Sure.
It couldn't have been. So it only makes sense, I think, that the invention was his pen name. And the very first time that the name William Shakespeare appeared in print was Venus and Adonis. So,
wow.
It ties together.
Mark, do you want to jump in with a question there?
Yeah, Catherine, as we read, say Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet, Macbeth in high school, are we seeing any hidden references to this identity issue, or are they not like really stated in the plays, and we could find them more in these sonnets that you just gave us an example of?
Yeah. Well, first off, most of the plays have to do with, upper class people, the nobility, aristocracy. Most of the heroes and heroines are people of that higher class, and he depicts them without any fault whatsoever. So, that's first an indication of that somebody with the same ilk is writing from experience. Also, the sonnets, which were the author's first-person ruminations, he seems to describe himself as a nobleman. Like, for example, he uses the term gracious to describe himself. Gracious, Shakespeare used the word gracious to describe royalty and high nobility. And he also, like, for example, another great one is Sonnet 125, where he says, "Were it aught to me, I bore the canopy." Now that is definitely a reference to how courtiers would hold the queen. The queen would be in like a litter with a canopy over it, and 4 or 5 courtiers would actually hold it and walk with her, and that was considered a great honor. And yet here you have this author of Shakespeare's Sonnet 125 saying, in essence, was it anything to me that I bore the canopy? Meaning he was not really impressed by it. It didn't really mean anything to him. Now, if it was the Stratford man, it would have been an unbelievable honor. But the Stratford man wouldn't have been, number one, wouldn't have been qualified to hold the candidacy because he was not a courtier. So, so there are personal indications in the works that he was somebody of, high rank. And also his contemporaries wrote that as well, and that's another point I wanted to get into. We have these remarks in print by his contemporaries, and they described him, and some described him as someone of rank. Some described him as someone who wrote anonymously or with a pen name. They described him as a generous patron. They were saying that he was well known to university students. They also said that by praising him would stain him, meaning it would injure his name. Now, that only would apply to somebody who was in the nobility. And that's when we come back to the idea of usage of a pen name. Because during that period, if you were of the nobility and you like to be involved in theater or writing poems, that was considered frivolous. If you're a nobleman, you should be working for the queen, in the government, in an office, or in the military. That's your proper place. But playing around with the theater, that was considered déclassé. And so he needed, in a way, to either write anonymously or with a pen name. It explains it perfectly.
Catherine, the nobility also got in charge of the Lord Chamberlain's men. Could you explain that, please?
Yes, the nobility sponsored acting companies too, and like the Lord Chamberlain had his own company of players. The Earl of Leicester had his own company. The Earl of Oxford, who I believe wrote the works, he had his own company of players. They needed somebody of authority to sponsor them because back then I believe they thought that actors were irresponsible or I don't know the exact reason, but they just couldn't. You just couldn't have your own acting company. You needed some sponsorship, and because the plays were also controlled, they needed to be controlled, especially for political content.
And the Earl of Pembroke was involved in producing the first folio?
Yes. That was another thing. Back then, often books were sponsored by noblemen, to pay for them because they were so expensive to produce. And the first folio, which is of the Shakespeare plays, was sponsored by the Earl of Pembroke and the Earl of Montgomery. And interestingly, the Earl of Montgomery was the Earl of Oxford's son-in-law. So that's an interesting connection right there. And to me, the responsibility of the Stratford men being associated with great author falls squarely on the shoulders of these two brother earls. And I get into that in a couple chapters in the work because I do believe it was a political move.
Oh, so that you're adding more intrigue there.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And since we're getting into some skirting around the political conspiracy topic, the Essex Rebellion kind of fits into this topic too, right?
Yes, it sure does. That's another incredible point that is not explainable by the Shakespeare establishment. In 1601, the Earl of Essex tried to take the throne from control the throne from Queen Elizabeth, and it failed miserably, and he was executed. Also, the Earl of Southampton was involved, who was associated with Shakespeare in two of the poems. But the interesting thing is that the day before Essex did his revolt, they performed a specific Shakespeare play, and that was Richard II. So it seemed that they used this particular play to warm up the London population in their own Essex's favor, because this is the one play that shows an English monarch being deposed and successfully deposed. And for that reason, the play gets very political. Now, the fascinating thing is that, that after the revolt failed, there was some investigation going on. And they did investigate as you mentioned, Lord Chamberlain's men and one of the actors. And they interrogated him, and they let him go, no problem. But they did not interrogate or investigate the author of the play, who was William Shakespeare. And how is it possible, if you were the Stratford man, that he was not questioned, that he was not imprisoned, that he was not even executed? I mean, this was not an era of free speech. There was censorship, and that's another unexplainable thing about Shakespeare.
Wow, fascinating. The thing that gets me is there's actually biographies existing of Shakespeare when we know so little about this guy, Catherine.
Yes, and unfortunately most are, I would say, like at least 90% speculation, and that's too bad. They're forced to kind of invent scenarios. Like, for example, one professor wrote in a book that the Merchant of Venice was inspired by the Shakespeare witnessing either the trial or the hanging of a Dr. Lopez, who was a converted Jew, and he was convicted of, I think, trying to poison the queen or something like that. And then he was executed. But there's no evidence at all for the Stratford man knowing about him or the case or anything. And so their biographies are usually they're just a description of the age, of the time, because the few solid facts that we have of the Stratford man just have nothing to do with writing or education or literary.
Wow.
I think that the general public needs to know that. They need to know the other side.
Yeah.
They need to know that contemporary writers
So
made comments about him, that he described someone totally different.
do we know when the last piece of Shakespeare's work was written then? Obviously he died at some point. He must have stopped writing eventually. Do we know about his death? Do we know when he stopped writing? His last work, the time frame?
Again, as I mentioned before, they don't know exactly when any of the plays were written, and they don't know what his last play was. I mean, they may turn to The Two Noble Kinsmen, which they think he co-wrote with John Fletcher around 1613. The Stratford died in 1616. You see, they have a very tight time schedule of how they can work in when the plays were written. They think because of one reference in 1592 to him being an upstart crow, which I don't believe was not describing Shakespeare. But anyway, they have that one reference, so they think that he may have started writing around circa 1590. And that went after he retired in Stratford, around circa 1613, so you have this 23-year period approximately when 40 plus plays were written. That's a pretty tall order for plays of this quality.
Yeah, Catherine. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay.
Okay. A little earlier in the interview, you mentioned that the supernova of 1572, was mentioned in one of the works. Do you think that we need to redate the plays in accordance with the real author's life, birth and death dates?
Yes, so 100%. In fact, thanks for bringing it up. That's a feature of my book, Shakespeare Suppressed. I make a listing of few hundred too early allusions. No, it was almost 100 too early allusions to the Shakespeare plays. So, for example, I list 12 too early allusions to the play Hamlet, and they start in like circa 1587 to 1597, something like a 10-year period. Well, why am I mentioning these dates? Because the professor thinks the Hamlet was written in circa 1600. And yet you have all these allusions to lines and the name Hamlet in other works that were printed much earlier. So yes, there needs to be an entire revolution of when the plays were written. And since then I've amassed several hundred more of these too early allusions, and it appears that the plays were written between 1562, something like that, and 1590s. So it's totally off.
Wow. Just coming up to the top of the first hour, Catherine, can you give us out your website and where we can get copies of your book?
My website is shakespearesuppressed.com, and you can order through the site, or you can, mostly people get it through Amazon. And I would also encourage those, at least in America, to ask your public library to get this book, buy this book, because I am with a major distributor, and they can get access to it.
Sure.
It's a research book, and I have over 600 footnotes. It's something that deserves to be in every public library, and the general public and students of Shakespeare need to see this information.
Okay, thank you,
There's
Catherine.
also some other great websites out there, too, that talk about it, like, for example, the Shakespeare Underground. .com, and the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, and another great one is doubtaboutwill.org, and there's a petition of reasonable doubt that the Stratford man wrote the works, and you can see who has signed this petition, and many of them are people with high academic degrees.
So, Catherine, tell me, maybe conspiratorial or political or whatever. Do you get into that? Do you subscribe to that? Why the silence? Why was Shakespeare suppressed? Why did nobody come up and say, I wrote that work if it was so good?
Yes, that's the great question. And as I mentioned, during his lifetime, he suppressed his own authorship because he was a nobleman. And that was just, he was obeying the social code. But after his death, he should have gotten credit. It would have been okay. The stigma of print would have disappeared. But for some very important reason, they did not give him that credit. They instead deliberately tried to put the credit on the Stratford man. I think part of it could be because there are some references in the plays to high-positioned people. Like, for example, Lord Burleigh, who was the Queen's top minister. He was lampooned in Hamlet in the character of Polonius. Also, Richard III. During this period, many people associated the hunchback Richard III, with the Shakespeare play Richard III, with Robert Cecil, who was also one of the Queen's ministers. So I think part of it could be because there are some loaded characters of real, important, powerful people back then, and also because I believe it really was a cover-up for the sonnets of Shakespeare, which seemed to laud the young man, the fair youth, as the Queen's successor, which would imply that the Queen had a child. And of course, I try and give historical evidence that would suggest this. Of course, I don't go into 2 chapters on that. But one of the great fascinating things about Shakespeare is that when he died, whoever he was, whenever he died, there was no notice taken. Nobody eulogized him. No one remarked about it. And back then, if you were a famous poet and playwright, you would get noticed. Like, for example, Francis Beaumont. He died the same year as the Stratford man in 1616. And there was wonderful notice taken near the time he died, and also he's buried in Westminster Abbey. The same thing was for Edmund Spenser. Many people wrote about his death, and he was buried in Westminster Abbey. But nobody said a word about the great Shakespeare when he died, and he was not buried at Westminster Abbey. So, again, there had to be some reason why everybody, the general public, the literary world, nobody knows it when he died. And I think that's suggestive of something politically dangerous about it.
Mm-hmm. On the contrary, then, the Stratford man, he must have been dead and gone, Catherine, because, you know, if he was getting the blame, quote, blame for doing the work of Shakespeare at the time when he was alive, he would have turned around and said, no, I'm not the Shakespeare guy.
Exactly. And also his family, too, would probably note that. So that's why I believe this happened decades after they had both died. And
it's quite a bungled...
and that's why the folio, you know, those opening pages, that's why the identification with the Stratford man was indirect. It was subtle. It wasn't overt. They wanted to suggest it was the Stratford man, but they didn't want to say that openly, 100% it was the Stratford man, because they knew that people were still alive that knew him and knew that he was not the great author.
Mm. Catherine, you just mentioned, you know, something about, you know, where Shakespeare was buried. You know, if we go there, to the church today, you know, he's buried in, the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, not, Westminster Abbey. You know, are there any clues at the church that, you know, might reveal that the wrong person is buried there?
Well, yeah, now we're talking about the monument to Shakespeare, which is on the wall in the Stratford-upon-Avon Church. And there's a few feet away, there's also in the ground, there's a burial stone with a curse on it. And they assume that this is Shakespeare's grave. You know, it says, it's a curse. Cursed be he who moves my bones, something like that. And yet, on the wall, with the monument, it says that Shakespeare is buried within that monument. That's a kind of an interesting contradiction. But the really interesting thing about the monument, today's monument, is that it has been changed. It is not the original monument. The original monument, we have documentary evidence of a picture of it that was made only a few years after the Stratford man had died, maybe 10, 12 years. And it showed a man holding a sack. And somehow it got transformed to a man holding a pen and paper, resting his elbows on a pillow, you know. And of course the Shakespeare establishment will tell you, no, of course this is the original monument. Today's monument is the same monument as it was before, and that the person who made that drawing, he got it wrong. You know, it's just circular reasoning.
What was in the sack?
The sack was, I would say, wool. It was a wool sack. And that is the trade, that was the trade of the Stratford man's father, John. So this has led, not me, but someone else with the theory, his name is Richard Kennedy, that the monument was originally to the Stratford man's father. It was his father's monument. And then the people who put together the folio, they were also Pembroke and Montgomery, they used the monument. They changed the inscription and turned it into a monument of Shakespeare. But I think that it goes beyond that. I think that after they changed the inscription, it got, the Civil War, the English Civil War came about, and soldiers and others were housed in the church there, and I think that, you know, it was damaged. There's records of after the Civil War to repair that part of the church. So I think that when they repaired it, they put a new effigy in there with a man holding a pen and paper. So it gets pretty complicated, but the evidence is there if you're willing to look at it.
Wow.
Okay.
Sorry, Mark, go ahead. No, go ahead, Mark.
Okay, Catherine, so, who was alive in, what, you're saying the 1570s? Who could have written all these plays set in Italy? Who was a political insider at the time? Who would have had access to be the canopy carrier for the Queen?
Yes. Well, to be a canopy holder, you had to have been a courtier or somebody of prominence. My theory, of course, is that the Earl of Oxford was a great author. And he was one of the Queen's favorite courtiers. He also had a superlative education. He went to Oxford when he was 12 or 13. He went to Cambridge when he was 8. He got his master's. Then he went to law school. And thereafter he went on a grand tour of Europe. And he spent most of his time in Italy. And as you know, many of the Shakespeare plays take place in Italy. And there's one fascinating book. It's called The Shakespeare Guide to Italy by Richard Waugh. And he does not get into the authorship at all. He just looks at these references to Italy in the plays of specific places. And not the tourist attraction places, not the big places, but the very minor, tiny, subtle landmarks. And he gives one, for example, of Romeo and Juliet, the very first passage, I believe. And there's a reference to sycamore trees outside of the western wall of Verona. And so, that's just a very minor little description in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. So he goes to Verona, and sure enough, right at the western wall today, there are sycamore trees in that same location. So this is a detail. How did the Stratford man come to know this detail? He didn't pick that up in a book. It was not in the original sources of the story of Romeo and Juliet. This was somebody who actually went there and knew it. And that alone disqualifies the Stratford man. But Mr. Rowe has many other of those instances in his book, and it's a wonderful book.
It seems to me, Catherine, there's been a lot of ignorance at play, for this to have believed so long. I mean, has it always been like this? Are we saying a lot of professors say, that there hasn't been questioned since 250 years after his death, but there's been snippets of evidence, really. Yes.
This has been a topic that's been going on for over 150 years. And they say, oh, well, it's only then that people question the authorship. And that's not the case. I mentioned earlier in the interview, in 1640, somebody said, Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise. Why? That doesn't make sense. And also, it's the same year in 1640. A book of Shakespeare's poems came out, and on the opening page they have a picture of Shakespeare that's based on the one that was in the folio, that famous black and white one by Droeshout. And underneath this image that they provide is a question mark. It says, this figure is renowned Shakespeare, the soul of the age. So you have right off the bat, very early on, the same century that Shakespeare died, you have somebody questioning the folio, questioning the image that this is really the man. Mm-hmm. So they never call upon that. Interesting observation.
Sure. Wow.
So they need to re-examine their case. They need to prove that the Stratford man was a great author during his lifetime. They just need to do that, and they won't. In fact, very recently, last year, being offered a £40,000 donation to the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. You know, if you can prove your case in a mock trial, we will give you a donation of £40,000, and that's by the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition.
Wow.
Yeah, and as far as I know, they have not taken them up on this offer. I mean, to me that says if their case was so concrete, you know, why don't they claim this money?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't they participate and claim the money? But I guess they still haven't decided if they're going to do it or not. So,
I guess I just want to take the moment to say, you know, regardless of who wrote it or who the pen name was or the great author, I mean, he was a great author. Like, you know, we're not going to take away from the work of whoever the author may have been. Do you think we're ever going to get to the bottom of it?
I think we will when, I think we're never going to change the academics, and they're the gatekeepers of Shakespeare. They're the ones basically who are saying, no, yeah, everything's fine. We need, it's basically up to the general public, I think, and that's my approach, to have the general public start putting heat on these people and throwing questions at them, saying, what really is going on? What is this book about? You know, why are they saying there's no evidence that he was a great author? Why are you still, and students, why are you still teaching, you know, this? Is it really a myth? You know, we need the general population to demand to know who the real Shakespeare was. I mean, if Shakespeare's life is not important, the real Shakespeare, then whose life is important? I mean,
sure.
You're talking about one of the greatest artistic, creative geniuses of all time.
Mm-hmm.
He certainly deserves, number one, the credit for his incredible works, but the public deserves to know his real life story. Mm-hmm. Sure. If you look at the Earl of Oxford's life, who almost certainly was a man, I mean, his life is filled with parallels between his life and the plays, and it comes alive. The plays come alive, and the man comes alive, and you can begin to see motivation for inspiration for writing some of these works.
Catherine, did you work on the movie Anonymous?
No, I didn't. But I met the screenwriter, and he's also a devoted Oxfordian. That's what we call ourselves.
Oh.
Yeah.
Did you meet with anyone or communicate with anyone else from the movie?
Oh yes, actually, Sir Derek Jacobi. He's one of the actors. He opened the work, and he read my book, and he sent me some great comments. He really enjoyed the book. So
cool.
Wow.
There's many Shakespearean actors who believe that the Stratfordian was not the great author, like, for example, Derek Jacobi, and also Jeremy Irons and Sir John Gielgud. You know, they all doubted the Stratford man.
Wow.
So, besides, there's so many academics in other disciplines, you know, outside of English literature that say that there is reason to doubt. Supreme Court justices. There's 3 of today's Supreme Court justices believe he was somebody else. So this is just not some trivial topic. It's very serious, and I hope this will interest your listeners.
For sure, Catherine. Listen, Catherine, I got coming up to the end of the show. I got one last question. It's the big one, I guess. Who is the author then? Have you got a short list of people you want to give out, or do you have a favourite who you think might be the real author?
Yes, the real author. He is Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, and a portrait of him is on the cover of my book. And
wow,
he had a fascinating life, and he's also somebody who historians seem to have ignored over the past few centuries. And the first real biographies came out just about less than 10 years ago, about 10 years ago. More about him, but it seems that the gatekeepers of Shakespeare are shutting them out, and I want to try and go directly to the public. And I got decided to finally write a book about this after being into it for over 20 years. when I saw a TV program in national TV in America, and they were interviewing an English literature professor, and he, in essence, put down the whole idea of there being an authorship question. I thought, who can get away with doing that? Who can, in essence, put down many people who are into the authorship question on national TV and not have to apologize for it? And so that's when I decided, okay, I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to try and put it from his point of view to see, what makes them so confident that the great author is who they think it is. And that led to almost 7 years. And I'm pretty happy with the results.
Wow. I do know one thing, Catherine, that Shakespeare fanatics do not like anybody addressing this question. They're quite dogmatic and sensitive about the whole thing.
Yes, but they're the ones who also cannot defend their case. I think they're enamored of the idea that someone with little education and no connections could turn himself into the greatest writer of the English language. I think it's really more of a fantasy or a hope than actual reality, and that's what my book goes into, the actual contemporary evidence for the Stratford man, and that's zero.
Wow. Of course, I mentioned Francis Bacon maybe being an author. I know that's not what we're going to talk about today, Catherine, but I first became aware of our guest right now. So let me talk to Catherine. Are you with us on the line, Catherine?
Yes, I am.
Wow. Thank you, and welcome to Capricorn Radio, Catherine.
My pleasure.
Catherine, that's quite an awesome academic piece of work that you have put together in that book. And when I get books submitted to the show and they come to the letterbox and they just poof off the floor, I know it's well researched. It's heavy duty. It hit the floor like a brick, but it's beautiful. These are the type of books I love because I know somebody has devoted a large chunk of their life and time to do this, and you're obviously passionate about this. Like all my guests, Catherine, I'm always intrigued in the person. Tell me about you as a person, what you like to do as a scholar, what drives you, and give us a bit of your personal background.
Sure. Well, after I graduated at UCLA, I fell into the authorship question about Shakespeare seeing a debate on TV, and I saw an academic from, I believe it was Princeton, debating Charlton Ogburn, who believes that the Earl of Oxford was the true Shakespeare. And all the Princeton scholar could say was doing attacks, saying that this is just a conspiracy theory, there's no evidence, and calling the man names like you're an amateur, that type of thing. And meanwhile, the Charlton Ogburn, he just named fact after fact that made perfect sense. And I didn't know anything about this, but I was a history major. And so I looked into it, and it just bit me. I just wanted to tell everybody about it. I read his book, and I started to give talks, and I just thought it was an extremely important thing to tell the world. I think that so many people love Shakespeare, and they want to know. It showed the man born in Stratford-on-Avon, we call him the Stratford man, and then they showed somebody else as being the true author, and that, in essence, he was his cover. I don't 100% believe in that theory, but it at least it separated the two, the real author and the Stratford man, and that was the best part of it.
I guess then there's two things to talk about. There's Stratford-upon-Avon, the location of Shakespeare, and then there's the Stratford man. So I guess let's talk about Stratford-upon-Avon first, the location of Shakespeare, where all the tourists go today, Catherine. Everybody flocks to Stratford-upon-Avon in England, known as the great place of the birthplace of the great author. And but this might not be correct, according to you, Catherine.
Right. Well, first off, I want to explain that there are two types of evidence for one to make a biography or a case for somebody being an author. There is contemporary lifetime evidence, and then there's posthumous evidence. Now, the concept that the great author William Shakespeare was from Stratford-on-Avon is entirely posthumous evidence, and that's what we need to clarify from the very beginning. If you look at the contemporary evidence, there was no association between Stratford and the great author. This is when the Stratford man was alive. So it was only occurring after his death that fingers started to point to that town as being associated with the great author. But during his lifetime, Shakespeare's contemporaries, people in the literary world, were describing him as somebody a little bit different. And that's what that's the evidence that we need to be focusing upon.
Sure. Mark, do you want to jump in there with a question? This whole subject matter through the work of Ignatius Donnelly, the great cryptogram. I actually have a first edition on my shelf. It's the only, I was reading Atlantis actually, and I came across some first editions, and I actually had addressed somebody. I went, first of all, I wanted to know, was this true or not? Maybe. And, I asked somebody about it, and I was met with such disdain and aggression. However, there was no thorough examination of the subject or discussion. It was just pure, dogmatic aggression and no academic philosophy at all on it. Like.
Yes. That's the usual thing. It's just, emotions come to the fore, and, people who defend the Stratford man just kind of will basically just put you down or put the old concept down, but they won't get into the evidence, and that's what we want to do.
I guess that's a good point.
Donnelly, he was using cryptograms to help provide evidence that he was Bacon, the great author was Bacon. But really, we don't really need to use cryptograms. I'm not an advocate of the cryptograms, but there's so much other evidence during the lifetime that during contemporary evidence that builds the case for an alternative author, and also that the Stratford man was not the great author. We don't really need those, in my opinion.
Sure.
So,
address the main question first about the Stratford man, or the idea of an alternative author. I guess that's the main question before you even point fingers. I know there was a movie as well, Catherine, wasn't there, in 2012 or 2011?
Yeah, Anonymous.
Anonymous, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, Anonymous. It was an English production, and it was very good. It was wonderful in that it showed a separation.
Let me tell you a little bit about the author, Catherine. Catherine Children is a BA in history at UCLA, has studied the Shakespeare authorship question for over 26 years. She has debated English professors from the Smithsonian Institute, Mechanics Institute Library, and in April 2012 received a Distinguished Scholarship Award at Concordia University, Portland, Oregon, for Shakespeare Suppressed. And I guess we're going to get into, the origins of the Shakespeare works, and there's a lot of doubt over this. It's something I'm aware of from the work of Francis Bacon, and maybe we'll touch a little bit on that, but it's not Catherine's angle, I believe. What an awesome book, by the way, I have to say, just before I bring my co-host and guest on for today. It's about 400 pages, and it's well researched, and it's academic, and you can tell that this woman has devoted her life to researching the subject. So let me bring our co-host on first. Mark, are you with me today?
Hi, James. Yes, I'm here.
Hey, my good friend Mark Eddy. It's good to talk to you, brother, again. Sorry for surprising you for a show, but you're well versed in this subject matter today, and I can't think of somebody better to join me. Great to talk to you again. Yeah, great to talk to you again, Mark. We're going to get into some Shakespeare stuff today.
All right.
Yeah, and we're going to talk to our